In our intro to malts video, I mentioned before that we don't know very much about the process of malting. We know the basics, but not really, an in-depth of how it's done. So one of my favorite things about making these videos is we get to do a deep dive into things like how crystal and caramel malts are made.
So today we are going deep into stewed malts.
What? Let's start with the basic process of how crystal/caramel malts are made.
So first of all, these are going to be germinated just like any other malt, any base malt, anything that you're working with, right? And then that's where things get a little bit different.
So instead of going through a drying process like every other malt does before it gets into the flavor building, stewed malts go directly from germination into either being kilned or heated in a roasting drum or in a kiln.
The next step in the process is actually going to heat those up to your 150 degree Fahrenheit saccharification rest. You're going to get that conversion of sugars to work with.
It's important to know when it comes to this that this only works because they go straight from germination into this next step. That leaves a lot of moisture content, about 42% moisture left over in the grains. So what you have is a bunch of tiny little kernels of mash tun going on.
This is where the whole sort of name stewed comes from, because you're actually going through a mashing process with these, unlike some of the other malts we've covered in our series so far.
So the next stage in the process is actually to heat them up to a temperature at which these can start to caramelize, hence the name crystal or caramel malts. This is going to happen at about 300 degrees minimum, and it's going to happen because you have sugars and moisture content left in the grain.
This is going to happen very, very rapidly, and ultimately how long you let this process go for is to determine whether or not you have a very light crystal malt like caramel 10 or a very dark crystal malt like caramel 150.
And this is not an easy science to lock down because this caramelization happens so rapidly that if the entire process takes 4 hours of the whole roasting, the actual part where caramelization occurs happens in 15 to 20 minutes. And so the maltsters have to be very, very skilled at knowing when to start pulling those grains out.
So now that you know the basic process behind this, let's break these stewed malts down into some subcategories. So first off, let's talk about dextrin malts. These actually do go through a slightly different process than the rest of our crystal malts. These are actually going to be pulled out of the roaster and kilned at about 195 degrees to glassify, I believe is the term that all of what I researched used, all those dextrins, and that ends up leaving them really hard, just like our Dextra Pills malt that we use here. This is going to actually leave you with very little to almost no flavor, because really all they're trying to get out of these is the dextrins in the malt itself. Ultimately, dextrin malts are highly overused in our opinion, because other crystal malts will still have dextrins, right?
Yeah, other crystal malts have dextrins, and so and there are other highly dextrinous malts you can use for just more flavor. For example, torrefied wheat has a nice puffed toasted character you can use it for. Chip malt, I use chip malt a lot, high in dextrins, high in enzymes too, so it has other utility.
With that said, I think that does have its place, but only in a few specific beers. What comes to my mind is if you're ever trying to do
IPAs or
very sessionable, light or low alcohol beer that you're trying to maintain a little bit of mouthfeel without getting very high in alcohol. Otherwise, that's kind of it for dextrin malts.
Yeah, I actually prefer to go with, instead of just a raw dextrin malt, if you're looking for a little bit of sweetness, use something like a caramel pills, which is basically Crystal 10. What that's going to do is going to give you the same amount of dextrins as a Carapils, but you got a little bit of that almost honey-like sweetness from some caramelization happening.
Yeah, just a little more complexity.
Yeah. So one thing we've been asked a lot is, I see crystal malts and caramel malts. Are those two different malts? And if so, how do they taste different? Well, the answer is that crystal and caramel malts are an interchangeable term, which basically is a term for a stewed malt. The only difference that I could find is that crystal malts 100% are finished off, or they have that caramelization of the sugars happening in a roaster, a drum roaster, whereas caramel malts can be either finished off in a drum roaster or in a kiln. And what this comes down to for you guys is that if it's crystal malts, that sweetness that you get off of it will be 100% caramelized sweetness, meaning it'll taste sweet, maybe slightly fruity, and that's it. If it's finished in a kiln, then sometimes it can have some Maillard reaction, which means you'll get some nutty flavors in there along with that caramelized sweetness.
I think ultimately though, based on the research that we've done, the maltsters really don't like to share with us how they made their malt. So for all intents and purposes, you could pretty much interchange a crystal malt for a caramel malt. If in doubt, I recommend tasting them using your own palate, especially if you got a homebrew shop available like us right here.
And every maltster makes the same malt differently, as we've been trying to prove with our chocolate malt, and soon to be a malt on brown malt video. But it comes down to your preference. So try as many things as you can, brew a lot, and good luck.
Now that we've talked about how crystal caramel malts are named, let's break them down. Let's break them down into, say, 3 sections. Let's talk about our light ones first, though. These are going to be malts that are going to fall somewhere between that 10 to, say, 30 Lovabond range.
Yeah, these are malts that are not terribly obtrusive. They don't have super strong flavors, and they have a little bit of color, but not a lot of color too. So they can still be blended in with light beers pretty well. They very much taste like, you know, the kind of sweetness that you get in honey or a light caramel, basically. So they don't, they're not obtrusive. They can go with a lot of things, and they still do add a lot of body because they have a good amount of the dextrins left in them.
In my opinion, these are the most versatile of the caramel malts. Like Peter said, you can put them in a lot of different things. Like we say, certain beers, just try not to get overloaded with them. But, you know, even in an IPA, even though on IPAs, you can still use, you know, a caramel 10 or a caramel 20 to maybe 5% of your grain bill, and it works out really well.
Yeah, and maybe try something like a Cara Vienne or a caramel Vienne, which is going to be basically sort of a crystal malt, but also sort of a biscuit malt. So you've got a more depth of character and a more subdued caramel sweetness.
Well, let's go on to our medium range, which is that sort of 40 to 75 Lovabond, at least for what we carry. These are going to be probably your most common crystal malts that you find, at least in recipes when they call for a crystal, especially if, you know, like we've dealt with, where somebody brings in a recipe and says, yeah, crystal malt.
Yeah.
Yeah, or caramel
If it doesn't
malt.
have a number on it, it's almost always 40 or 60.
So, so these are your most typical ones. These actually start getting into a very typical sweet, and as the name says, caramely type flavor to them.
Yeah, and on that 75 end, on that darker end, or 80 Lovabond, I start to get notes of toffee. So like the caramel sweetness, almost to a toffee-like sweetness towards that darker end.
And those can also actually have some degree of sort of toastiness or roastiness as well, which is just a very hint of that, I call it burnt sugar flavor.
Yeah.
Because that's actually what it is. It is a burnt sugar flavor.
It's burnt beer sugars. And another way to think about this range is like, this is your English range. If you see a recipe that is English-based, so a porter, a stout, you know, an English amber or a mild, and they're calling for caramel malts, it's almost always going to be in this range.
One thing he forgot to mention, though, for beer styles would also be things like Scotch ales are going to be very dominant in these medium to even heavy range crystal malts, as well as California Commons, which he even let me know this morning
California
is
Commons.
a classic middle range caramel 60 to maybe 70 Lovabond, which is the dominant malt flavor in those beers.
Yeah, California Commons, I think, is a very two-note beer. They go for base, caramel 60, and then just that mintiness from Northern Brewer hops.
Pretty much, yeah. Well, let's go right into our dark malts. These ones are kind of fun, actually, because, yeah, so now we're talking about, like, caramel 90s all the way up to 150,
yeah.
maybe even, like,
65.
I'm sure there's some darker ones out there.
So yeah, these darker caramel malts, crystal malts, are actually the ones that I prefer to use if I'm going to use any caramel crystal malt at all. The reason being, the flavors become a lot more complex and nuanced in this range. You can get, depending on how they're roasted, flavors of date and raisin and, you know, certain nuttinesses that you wouldn't expect. You get burnt toffee, burnt sugar, molasses. There's just a lot more depth. And these are ones that you don't expect and shouldn't use an overbearing amount of. And so people kind of naturally back off from using these ones too much. Whereas in that 60 and below range, people kind of are like, yeah, I can throw 30% in there, which is a terrible idea.
Terrible.
But yeah, people naturally tend to back off when they're using these. Using these darker crystal malts at 5 to 10%, you can really add depth to your beer. And that's why I like these ones better than I do the lighter end.
As for beer styles that we like to use these in, I mean, I've got a few. It's like, you know, for one, anything dark. I don't know if Peter mentioned that, but yeah, anything dark. Porters, stouts. What do we got? I got Baltic porters. Oh, imperial stouts. Imperial stouts you're going to throw the book of dark malts at, though. So.
Yeah.
But also, like, things like brown ales could actually benefit from a very small amount of these. as well as if you've ever had a black IPA. Usually there's going to be some degree of a really, really heavy dark crystal malt because you get a nice coloration from it and you get a really complex flavor without having to throw excessive amounts of a malt at a beer.
And I'll add, if I'm making an amber or a red colored beer, I would rather throw a small percentage of these darker malts than a big percentage of like a Crystal 40.
Yeah. And with that said, let's not get too carried away with the IPAs, right? We don't want to be throwing 4 ounces of this into like a West Coast IPA.
Right, yeah.
Just because they do still have strong flavors, unless that's what you're going for, probably not going to be appropriate for the style.
But if you are doing a red IPA or like a Northwest IPA, this is a great way to get all the color you need with a lot less malt, which is really important because you can overload that sweetness factor very, very quickly with crystal malts.
Yeah.
So now that we've talked about the range of standard crystal malts, let's go to some crystal or caramel adjacent malts, or as Logan likes to call them, caramel fluid. These are going to be malts that have a lot of that same kind of caramel sweetness that you're looking for when you hear caramel malts, that caramelization, but they usually have some dryness, some toastiness, and they involve unique methodologies to get that same caramelization.
I think ultimately these are some of the most complex malts that we deal with. And just to give you a great example, we've been playing with one over the last year or so. It's called Special X from Best Malls. But also another very similar one would be a malt like Cara Aroma from
Wireman.
And also one from Great Western, our local maltster, which is Cara Steam. I think ultimately these, for their color range, have more complexity compared to their more traditional caramel or crystal malt.
Their brethren.
Brethren, yeah, exactly, yeah. And that's partly why we love them. So they have the complexity without the dryness.
Now, these malts that have that same kind of color but without the same sweetness, they all use proprietary methods to get their whatever they do. Some of them will use steam in some sense. Some of them will use different malting mechanisms, whether or not they half kiln and half roast. But they're a lot more difficult to nail down.
Ultimately, I think that these can be universally subbed for any crystal malt, even though they're, at least in my opinion, more or less a hybrid between a crystal and a traditionally kilned malt. But yeah, complexity without the sweetness, because you're going to get plenty of sweetness. Well, I think that's it. I think we got her.
Yeah, if you've got any questions on specific malts that are caramel/crystal or caramel adjacent, please let us know in the comments below. If you've got experiences with any of these specialty malts, like Cara Steam, for example, which I don't see a lot of people using up here, but I love that malt. Also let us know in the comments below. Share your favorite recipe. Just link it. I'd love to get a little bit more of a community thing going down in the comments. And like and subscribe to our channel.
Otherwise, viva la beer.
Viva la beer.
Good night, because we no longer have our IRA on tap. Hell yeah. Woo.